Well, it's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. This is one of the many contexts of chapel that I've seen over the different buildings that we have been in. And I cleaned some of those areas. That was one of my multiple roles. Carl and I, as you know, have been serving at Woodville for 8 months. It's been a stretching and challenging experience. This is a lovely 200-year-old plus church and building, and a stalwart congregation in the sense of they paid a big price to be global Methodist. They stood for the Word of God. They stood through the storm of leaving one denomination and joining another and being faithful to the Word of God. And it's a privilege to serve them. Every church has its own separate DNA, and this one is one we've been leading into and trying to get to know. And one interesting thing is that they have a larger midweek service than they have a Sunday service. And the reason is they have but one teenager in their congregation, but he is mighty. He is the homecoming king and the quarterback, and we have a lovely couple that are ministering to our youth. And Jacob, on Wednesday, brings 10 or 12 youth with him to Wednesday service. They're not our youth. They're other churches or non-churched at all. But they come with him, and our lovely Philip and Jenny teach a youth Bible study at the same time that the Bible study that I'm teaching in the fellowship hall goes on. So that's been a different thing. We have no children. We have a grandchild that comes, and we're serving him during the sermon and on Wednesday. And occasionally on vacations we have a gust of 3 or 4 grandchildren. But it's a pleasure and a stretch to learn to minister to the people there are in the way that we feel like would please the Lord. And it's been enriching to our soul and causes us to call on the Lord for the kind of strength and wisdom. Because this is the kind of congregation where we've had 5 funerals, where we minister to homebound people through communion, where we're doing hospital visitation, and that's some of the major things one does with an aging congregation. But aging people deserve pastoral care as well. So we've been blessed by God to be able to do that. What I wanted to do was to read one of the Lenten readings that's been a blessing to me. This book is called Bread and Wine, Reading for Lent and Easter. It's by international authors and authors that start with Augustine and go on up. And this one is by Philip Yancey, and it's called Jesus Reminders. The image Jesus left with the world, the cross, the most common image in the Christian religion, is proof that God cares about our suffering and pain. He died of it. Today that image is coated with gold and worn around the necks of beautiful girls, a symbol of how far we can stray from the reality of history. But it stands, unique among all religions of the world. Many of them have gods, but only one has a God who cared enough to become a man and die. Dorothy Sayers says, for whatever reason God chose to make man as he is, limited and suffering and subject to sorrows and death, he had the honesty and courage to take his own medicine. Whatever game he is playing with his creation, he has kept his own rules and played fair. He can exact nothing from man that he has not exacted from himself. And he has gone through the whole human experience, from the trivial irritations of family life and the cramping restrictions of hard work and the lack of money to the worst horrors of pain and humiliation, defeat, despair, and death. When he was a man, he played the man. He was born in poverty, died in disgrace, and thought it well worthwhile. I want to say I do recognize that Jesus continues to be a man. He's not given up that role. To some, the image of a pale body glimmering on a dark night whispers of defeat. What good is a God who does not control his Son's suffering? What possible good could such a God do for us? But a louder sound can be heard, the shout of a God crying to man, I love you. Love was compressed for all history in that lonely, bleeding figure, Jesus, who said he could call down the angels at any moment and rescue himself from the horror, but chose not to because of us. For God so loved us that he sent his only Son to die for us. What practical effect does Christ's identification have on the person who actually suffers? A dramatic example of the effect of this truth was seen in the ministry of Dr. Paul Brand while he was working among the leprosy patients in Vellore, India. There he preached a sermon, one of his best known and best loved. At the time, Brand and his workers were among the few in the area who would touch or closely approach a person with Hansen's disease. Townspeople quarantined them. Brand slipped in late to a patient's gathering, sitting on the mat at the edge of an open courtyard. The air was heavy with the combined odors of crowding bodies, poverty, stale spices, treated bandages. The patients insisted on a few words from Dr. Brand, and he reluctantly agreed. He stood for a moment, empty of ideas, looking at the patients before him. His eyes were drawn to their hands, dozens of them, most pulled inward in the familiar leprosy claw hand. Some with no fingers, some with a few stumps. Many patients sat on their hands or otherwise hid them from view. I am a hand surgeon, he began, and waited for the translation into Tamil and Hindi. So when I meet people, I can't help looking at their hands. The psalmist claims, the palmist claims he can tell your future by looking at your hands. I can tell your past. For instance, I can tell what your trade has been by the position of the calluses and the condition of the nails. I can tell a lot about your character. I love hands. He paused and looked at the eager faces. How I would have loved to have a chance to meet Christ and study his hands. But knowing what he was like, I can almost picture them, feel them. He paused again and wondered aloud what it would have been like to meet Christ and study his hands. He traced the hands of Christ, beginning with infancy when his hands were small, helpless, futilely grasping. Then came the hands of the boy Jesus, holding a brush or stylus, trying to form letters of the alphabet. Then the hands of Christ, the carpenter, rough with broken fingernails and bruises from working with saw and hammer. Then there were the hands of Christ, the physician, the healer. Compassion and sensitivity seemed to radiate from them, so much that when he touched people, they could feel something of the divine spirit coming through. Christ touched the blind, the diseased, the needy. Then continued Dr. Brand, there were his crucified hands. It hurts me to think of a nail being driven through his hand, because I know what goes on there, the tremendous complex of tendons and nerves and blood vessels and muscles. It's impossible to drive a spike through a hand without crippling it. The thought of those healing hands being crippled reminds me of what Christ was prepared to endure. In fact, he identified himself with all the deformed and crippled human beings in the world. Not only was he able to endure poverty with the poor, weariness with the tired, but clawed hands with the cripple. The effect on the listening patients, all social outcasts, was electrifying. Jesus, a cripple with claw hands like theirs. Brand continued, And then there were his resurrected hands. One of the things I find most astounding is that though we think of the future life as something perfected, when Christ appeared to his disciples, he said, "Come, look at my hands." And he invited Thomas to put his finger into the print of the nail. Why did he want to keep the wounds of his humanity? Wasn't it because he wanted to carry back with him an eternal reminder of the sufferings of those on earth? He carried the marks of suffering so he could continue to understand the needs of the suffering. He wanted to be forever one with us. As he finished, Paul Brand was again conscious of hands as they lifted all over the courtyard, palm to palm in the Indian gesture of respect, namaste. The hands were the same stumps, the same fingers missing, the same crooked arches, yet no one tried to hide them. They were held high, close to the face, in respect for Brand, but also with a new pride and dignity. God's own response to suffering made theirs easier. Poet laureate T.S. Eliot wrote in one of his famous poems, Four Quarters, "The wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Beneath the bleeding hands we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art." The surgery of life hurts. It helps me, though, to know that the surgeon himself, the wounded surgeon, has felt every stab of pain and every sorrow. Phil Yancey, the article, Jesus' Reminders. Now I wanted us to sing the current song that I'm memorizing for Lent. Last year it was, it goes blank now that I want to think of it. It'll come to me. But this year it's, "O Love Divine, What Hast Thou Done?" I have memorized the verses and can sing it by myself in the car over the long journey to Woodville. But Charles Wesley, both the theology and the emotional aspect of it, the personal aspect, "Come feel with me his blood applied," is the closing phrase.
We're going to sing a cappella. Let's lift our voices together.